The ancient castle of Valdoria stood majestically against the stormy evening sky, its towers piercing through the dark clouds that gathered ominously overhead. King Alexander III walked through the marble corridors with heavy steps, his mind troubled by the recent whispers that had reached his ears through the castle's network of loyal servants. The 60-year-old monarch had ruled Valdoria with wisdom and grace for over 3 decades, but tonight, his heart carried a burden that threatened to shatter everything he held dear. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Alexander's thoughts drifted to his beloved wife, Queen Isabella. They had been married for 25 years, a union that had begun as a political alliance but had blossomed into what he believed was genuine love. Isabella, with her flowing auburn hair and gentle green eyes, had been his anchor through countless royal duties, diplomatic crises, and the everyday challenges of ruling a kingdom. She was known throughout Valdoria for her charitable works, her grace during state functions, and her unwavering support of her husband's reign. The royal couple had weathered many storms together. They had mourned the loss of their first child, celebrated the births of their twin sons Prince Marcus and Prince Adrian, and stood united during the economic difficulties that had plagued their kingdom 5 years earlier. Through it all, Isabella had been the picture of loyalty and devotion, never giving Alexander reason to doubt her commitment to their marriage or the crown. But tonight was different. Tonight, Alexander carried in his coat pocket a letter that had arrived through mysterious circumstances. The parchment, sealed with an unfamiliar crest, contained allegations so shocking that he had read it 3 times before the words fully registered in his mind. According to the anonymous sender, Queen Isabella had been conducting secret meetings in the abandoned east wing of the castle, meetings that occurred during the late hours when the royal household believed her to be in her private chambers, tending to correspondence or reading. The letter spoke of clandestine encounters, of whispered conversations behind locked doors, and of a deception so profound that it called into question everything Alexander thought he knew about his wife. The writer claimed to have witnessed these secret meetings on multiple occasions, providing specific dates and times that made the accusations impossible to dismiss as mere gossip or the ravings of a disgruntled courtier. As Alexander paused before a tall window overlooking the royal gardens, he watched the rain begin to fall in heavy drops against the glass. The storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest brewing within his soul. How could he confront Isabella with such serious accusations? What if the letter was merely an attempt by enemies of the crown to sow discord within the royal family? Yet, what if the allegations were true? What if the woman he had trusted above all others had been living a lie for months, perhaps even years? The king's mind raced through recent memories, searching for signs he might have missed. He recalled Isabella's occasional absences from their shared evening meals, explained away as headaches or fatigue. He remembered mornings when she seemed distant, distracted, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. There had been new jewelry that appeared in her collection, pieces he didn't remember gifting her, though she had claimed they were inherited items from her late aunt's estate. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he pulled the letter from his pocket once more. The paper felt heavy in his fingers, weighted with the potential to destroy not just his marriage, but the stability of the entire kingdom. Valdoria was a nation built on tradition, honor, and the sacred nature of the royal union. If word of scandal reached the people, it could undermine the very foundations upon which his reign rested. The castle corridors seemed longer and more imposing as Alexander continued his evening walk, a routine he had maintained for years as a way to clear his mind after long days of royal duties. Tonight, however, the familiar paintings and tapestries that lined the walls offered no comfort. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to watch him with knowing eyes, as if they too were aware of the crisis that threatened to unfold. As he approached the east wing of the castle, the very area mentioned in the mysterious letter, Alexander's steps slowed. This section of Valdoria Castle had been in use for decades, deemed too costly to maintain after a fire had damaged several rooms 15 years earlier. The wing was not officially restricted, but it was generally avoided by both staff and family members due to its state of disrepair and the persistent rumors that it was haunted by the ghost of Queen Margarita, Alexander's great-grandmother, who had died under mysterious circumstances. The flickering light of the wall torches created dancing shadows as Alexander stood at the entrance to the east wing, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. Part of him wanted to turn away, to return to his chambers, and pretend he had never received the letter. But another part, the part of him that was king before he was husband, demanded that he uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might prove to be. Taking a deep breath, Alexander stepped into the abandoned wing, his footsteps echoing eerily in the empty hallways. The air was thick with dust and neglect, and cobwebs stretched across doorways like ghostly curtains. As he moved deeper into the wing, following the path described in the letter, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Despite the overall abandonment of the area, there were recent footprints in the dust, clear evidence that someone had been using this supposedly forgotten part of the castle. The letter had specifically mentioned a room at the far end of the corridor, a chamber that had once served as a private library for the royal family. As Alexander approached the door, he could see a faint light emanating from beneath it, and his heart nearly stopped beating. Someone was indeed there, just as the letter had claimed. The sound of voices, muffled but unmistakably present, reached his ears through the thick wooden door. Standing in the shadows of the corridor, Alexander found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of the moment. Whatever lay beyond that door would change his life forever. If Isabella was truly inside, conducting whatever secret business the letter had described, then his world would come crashing down around him. If the room was empty, or if the occupants proved to be innocent castle staff attending to some forgotten duty, then he would have allowed suspicion and paranoia to nearly destroy his faith in the woman he loved. The voices beyond the door grew slightly louder, though the words remained indistinct. Alexander recognized one of the voices as distinctly feminine, with the refined accent and measured tones that could indeed belong to Isabella. The second voice was deeper, masculine, unfamiliar to his ears. The king's hands clenched into fists at his sides as he struggled with the decision of whether to burst through the door immediately or to listen and gather more information before revealing his presence. Thunder crashed overhead, perfectly timed with the emotional storm raging within Alexander's heart. The rain had intensified, beating against the windows of the castle with increasing fury, as if nature itself was responding to the drama unfolding within the ancient walls. In that moment, standing alone in the darkened corridor, King Alexander III of Valdoria realized that his life, his marriage, and his kingdom stood on the precipice of irreversible change. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in those final moments before the truth would be revealed. Whatever secrets lay behind the door, whatever betrayals or innocent explanations awaited him, Alexander knew that he could not turn back now. The path forward led only through the confrontation that would define not just his personal fate, but the future of the entire royal lineage of Valdoria. As he reached for the door handle with a trembling hand, Alexander offered a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, hoping against hope that his worst fears would prove unfounded, but preparing himself for the possibility that everything he had believed about his life and his love was about to be shattered forever. With his heart hammering against his chest like a war drum, King Alexander slowly turned the ornate brass handle of the library door. The metal felt cold beneath his palm, and the mechanism turned with surprising silence, as if it had been recently oiled and maintained despite the apparent abandonment of the East Wing. As the door opened just a crack, the voices inside became clearer, and what Alexander heard made his blood freeze in his veins. The arrangements have been made. Isabella's voice carried clearly through the gap in the door, her tone businesslike and determined in a way Alexander had never heard before. The documents are ready for transfer, and the payment has been confirmed through the Swiss accounts. We cannot afford any mistakes at this stage. Alexander's world tilted on its axis as he processed these words. Documents, Swiss accounts, payment. This was not the language of an innocent meeting, nor was it the vocabulary of a simple romantic affair, as he had feared. This sounded like something far more sinister, something that threatened not just their marriage, but potentially the security of the entire kingdom. Through the narrow opening, Alexander could see into the restored library, and what he witnessed defied all his expectations. The room, which should have been covered in dust and decay like the rest of the East Wing, was instead immaculately maintained. Rich Persian rugs covered the floor, elegant furniture filled the space, and modern communication equipment sat on polished wooden tables. This was not an abandoned room being used for clandestine meetings. This was a fully operational secret office, hidden within his own castle. Isabella stood near a large mahogany desk, dressed not in her usual elegant royal attire, but in simple dark clothing that would allow her to move through the castle unnoticed. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and Her gentle features were set in an expression of cold determination that Alexander had never seen before. She appeared to be reviewing a stack of official-looking documents while speaking to a tall, thin man with graying hair who stood with his back partially turned to the door. "Your Majesty has exceeded our expectations," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Alexander couldn't immediately place. "The intelligence you've provided about the kingdom's defense systems and trade agreements has been invaluable. Our organization is most grateful for your continued cooperation." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. Intelligence? Defense systems? Trade agreements? The implications crashed over him in waves of horror and disbelief. His wife, his trusted partner in ruling Valdoria, was engaged in what could only be described as espionage or treason. She was selling state secrets to unknown parties, using her position as queen to access and distribute information that could compromise the safety and sovereignty of their nation. The upcoming treaty negotiations with the neighboring kingdoms present an excellent opportunity, Isabella continued, her voice devoid of any emotion as she discussed matters that could affect thousands of lives. "I will have access to all preliminary discussions and proposed terms. The information should be quite valuable to your clients." Alexander watched in stunned silence as the woman he had loved and trusted for 25 years calmly discussed betraying their kingdom's diplomatic secrets. The treaty negotiations she referenced were of critical importance to Valdoria's future, involving trade agreements and defense pacts that could determine the kingdom's prosperity and security for generations to come. That she would sell this information to foreign interests was beyond his comprehension. The mysterious man handed Isabella a leather portfolio, which she accepted with the casual indifference of someone conducting routine business. "The payment for the previous information has been deposited as agreed," he said. "The amount reflects the exceptional value of the military installation details you provided last month." Military installations. Alexander's knees nearly buckled as he heard these words. Isabella had access to classified military information through her role in various royal councils and her presence at high-level security briefings. If she had been sharing details about Valdoria's defensive capabilities and military installations, she had potentially exposed the kingdom to invasion or attack from hostile neighbors. As Alexander continued to observe through the crack in the door, he noticed additional details that painted an even more disturbing picture. Maps of Valdoria were spread across one table, marked with notations in Isabella's familiar handwriting. A sophisticated radio communication device sat active on a shelf, its green light indicating it was operational and possibly connected to contacts outside the kingdom. Most shocking of all, Alexander spotted copies of official royal seals and stamps, tools that would allow Isabella to authenticate false documents or forge royal correspondence. "The timing for the next phase is crucial," Isabella said, moving to examine one of the maps. "The harvest festival next month will provide the perfect distraction. The royal family and most of the court will be focused on the celebrations, and security will be lighter in the administrative areas of the castle. I should be able to access the treasury records and the new defense contracts without difficulty." Treasury records. Defense contracts. Alexander realized that Isabella's treachery went far beyond selling existing information. She was actively planning future thefts of state secrets, using royal celebrations and family traditions as cover for her espionage activities. The Harvest Festival had always been one of Isabella's favorite events, a time when she seemed most genuinely happy as she participated in the ancient traditions of their kingdom. To learn that she viewed it merely as an opportunity for further betrayal felt like a knife to Alexander's heart. The stranger pulled out a photograph from his coat pocket and showed it to Isabella. Though Alexander couldn't see the image clearly from his position, Isabella's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face darkened, and she nodded grimly as she studied whatever the photograph contained. "The target has been identified and is under surveillance," the man said quietly. "If the king becomes suspicious or begins asking questions about your activities, we may need to implement the contingency plan we discussed." Contingency plan. The words sent a chill down Alexander's spine as he realized that these conspirators had apparently anticipated the possibility of discovery and had prepared some form of response. The reference to a target in connection with his potential suspicions suggested that his own safety might be at risk if Isabella believed he was getting too close to uncovering her secret activities. "I've been careful," Isabella replied, her voice taking on a slightly defensive tone. "Alexander suspects nothing. He trusts me completely, just as he always has. His faith in me is both his greatest weakness and our greatest asset. Hearing his wife describe his love and trust as weaknesses to be exploited was perhaps the most painful moment of Alexander's life. The woman he had shared his bed with, raised children with, and planned to grow old with was coldly discussing how to manipulate his emotions for the benefit of unknown enemies of his kingdom. As Alexander continued to listen, more details of the conspiracy emerged. Isabella had apparently been recruited years earlier, possibly even before their marriage, though the exact timeline remained unclear from the conversation. The operation was sophisticated and well-funded, with multiple contacts and safe houses established throughout Valdoria and neighboring kingdoms. Isabella was not acting alone, but was part of a larger network of individuals working to undermine the stability and security of his realm. The betrayal went deeper than Alexander could have imagined in his worst nightmares. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment or a recent development driven by some personal crisis. This was a calculated, long-term deception that had apparently been ongoing for years, possibly throughout the entirety of their marriage. Everything he thought he knew about Isabella, every memory of their life together, was now tainted by the knowledge that she had been living a lie and using their relationship to harm the very kingdom he had devoted his life to protecting. The storm outside intensified, and a particularly loud crack of thunder caused both Isabella and her conspirator to pause their conversation momentarily. In that brief silence, Alexander heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor behind him. Someone was approaching, and if he were discovered eavesdropping on this secret meeting, the consequences could be catastrophic not just for him personally, but for the kingdom's security. Faced with the immediate threat of discovery and armed with devastating knowledge of his wife's treachery, Alexander realized he had to make a critical decision. He could confront Isabella and her co-conspirator immediately, though he was unarmed and outnumbered. He could retreat and gather loyal guards to arrest them, though this might give them time to destroy evidence or escape. Or he could continue listening to gather more information about the full scope of the conspiracy, risking his own safety and the possibility that vital intelligence might be lost if the meeting concluded before he could act. The footsteps in the corridor grew closer, and Alexander knew his time was running out. Whatever choice he made in the next few moments would determine not only his own fate, but the future of everyone in Valdoria who depended on him for protection and leadership. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, and the burden of kingship had never been more real than in this moment of ultimate betrayal and danger. The approaching footsteps forced Alexander into immediate action. Without hesitation, he pushed open the library door and stepped into the room, his royal bearing masking the emotional turmoil raging within him. The sudden appearance of the king caused both Isabella and her conspirator to freeze in shock, their faces displaying the terror of people caught in the act of committing an unthinkable crime. Alexander. Isabella gasped, her carefully controlled composure crumbling in an instant. The documents she had been holding scattered to the floor as her hands began to tremble. For a brief moment, the woman who had been coldly discussing the betrayal of her kingdom transformed back into the wife who had shared his life for over 2 decades, her green eyes wide with fear and what might have been genuine remorse. The mysterious stranger reacted with the trained instincts of a professional spy, immediately moving toward what appeared to be an escape route near the far window, while simultaneously reaching inside his coat for what Alexander suspected was a weapon. However, the king's commanding voice stopped him in his tracks. "I wouldn't move another step if I were you," Alexander declared with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "The royal guards are already surrounding this wing of the castle. Your only choice now is to surrender and hope for mercy, or to add the murder of a king to your list of crimes." This was a bluff, as Alexander had come to the East Wing alone, but his years of royal training in diplomacy and intimidation served him well. The stranger hesitated, clearly calculating his options and finding them limited. Isabella, meanwhile, had sunk into a chair, her face buried in her hands as the full weight of her exposure crashed down upon her. "How long?" Alexander asked, his voice steady despite the emotional chaos within him. "How long have you been betraying everything we built together, Isabella? How long have you been selling our kingdom's secrets to our enemies?" Isabella raised her head slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her eyes held a defiance that surprised Alexander. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion. You've never understood anything beyond your precious duty and honor. You live in a fantasy world where kingdoms and crowns matter more than real people's lives. The accusation stung, but Alexander pressed forward. Real people's lives? Do you think the citizens of Valdoria are not real people? Do you think the soldiers who defend our borders are not real? You've put every single one of them at risk with your actions. The people of Valdoria have suffered under your rule. Isabella shot back, rising from her chair with sudden anger. Your policies have kept them poor while you live in luxury. Your treaties have favored the wealthy nobles while the common people struggle to feed their families. I've been working with organizations that actually care about creating a better world. The stranger, sensing an opportunity in the heated exchange between the royal couple, slowly reached into his coat again. This time, his movement didn't go unnoticed by Alexander, who had learned to be observant of potential threats during his decades as king. In a swift motion that surprised everyone in the room, Alexander lunged forward and tackled the man before he could draw his weapon. The two men struggled violently, crashing into furniture and sending precious artifacts tumbling to the floor. Despite his 60 years, Alexander fought with the desperation of a man defending not just his own life, but the future of his kingdom. The stranger was younger and trained in combat, but Alexander had the advantage of righteous fury and the element of surprise. Isabella watched the struggle with apparent horror, though Alexander couldn't tell if her distress was for his safety or for the failure of her conspiracy. When the stranger managed to break free and pull a knife from his coat, Isabella suddenly screamed, "Stop! Don't hurt him!" The cry gave Alexander the moment he needed to grab a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby table and strike his opponent across the head. The stranger collapsed unconscious to the floor, his weapon clattering away across the Persian rug. Alexander stood over the fallen man, breathing heavily and feeling every one of his 60 years in his aching muscles. "You still care about me," Alexander said quietly, looking at his wife with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "After everything you've done, some part of you still cares about my well-being." Isabella's tears flowed more freely now, and she seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. "I never wanted you to be hurt physically," she admitted. "I never wanted violence. I thought I could accomplish everything without anyone getting hurt." Without anyone getting hurt. Alexander's voice rose in disbelief. "Isabella, you've been selling military secrets that could lead to invasions. You've been providing information about our defenses that could get our soldiers killed. How did you think no one would get hurt?" The queen sat down heavily, looking older than her 55 years. "The organization I work with, they promised me they were working toward peaceful change. They said the information would be used to prevent conflicts, not start them. They convinced me that by weakening certain aspects of Valdoria's military position, we could force negotiations that would benefit everyone." "And you believe them?" Alexander asked, though he could see in her eyes that she was beginning to doubt her own justifications. "Isabella, you're an intelligent woman. You know how the world works. Did you really think foreign agents paying you vast sums of money for state secrets had peaceful intentions?" The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor interrupted their conversation. This time, Alexander recognized the measured march of royal guards, apparently alerted by the sounds of struggle coming from the supposedly abandoned wing. Within moments, Captain Henrik of the Royal Guard burst through the door with 4 armed men behind him. "Your Majesty," Henrik exclaimed, taking in the scene of the unconscious stranger, the scattered documents, and the Queen's tear-stained face. "We heard sounds of conflict and came to investigate. Are you harmed?" Alexander looked at his wife one more time before answering. "I am unharmed, Captain. But we have a serious situation here that requires immediate attention. This man is a foreign agent, and these documents contain evidence of espionage against the crown." Henrik's experienced eye quickly assessed the room, noting the communication equipment, the maps, and the official seals. His expression grew grim as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. "Shall I place him under arrest, Your Majesty?" "Yes," Alexander replied firmly. "Take him to the high-security cells in the tower. Post guards around the clock, and ensure he has no opportunity to communicate with anyone outside the castle. We need to determine who he works for and what other secrets may have been compromised." As the guards moved to secure the unconscious stranger, Alexander faced the most difficult decision of his reign. Isabella sat quietly, no longer trying to defend her actions or escape responsibility for what she had done. The evidence of her treachery surrounded them, and yet she remained his wife, the mother of his children, and the woman he had loved for most of his adult life. What about the Queen, Your Majesty? Captain Henrik asked quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but duty-bound to follow his king's commands. Alexander studied Isabella's face, searching for any sign of the woman he had married, the woman he had believed her to be. "Leave us," he commanded the guards. "Wait outside the door, but give us privacy for this conversation." When they were alone again, Alexander approached his wife slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal capable of sudden violence. "I need to know everything, Isabella. I need to know who recruited you, how long this has been going on, and exactly what information you've shared. If you cooperate fully, if you help me understand the full scope of this conspiracy, then perhaps we can find a way through this that doesn't destroy everything we've built together." Isabella looked up at him with eyes full of pain and confusion. "You would still try to save me? After everything I've done?" "I'm trying to save Valdoria," Alexander replied honestly. "If saving you is part of that, then yes. But if you continue to lie to me, if you continue to protect the people who used you to betray our kingdom, then I will have no choice but to treat you as I would any other traitor to the crown." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air as Isabella realized that her next choice would determine not only her own fate, but the future of the royal family and possibly the kingdom itself. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the secret library, a different kind of tempest was reaching its crucial turning point. Isabella stared at her hands for a long moment. The silence in the secret library broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the steady drip of rain against the windows. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of years of hidden guilt and carefully constructed lies. "It started before we were married," she began, her confession falling into the quiet room like stones into still water. "I was 19, still Princess Isabella of Montclair, when they first approached me. I was young, idealistic, and angry about the arranged marriage my father was forcing upon me. I didn't want to marry a king I had never met for the sake of political alliance." Alexander felt as though the floor had shifted beneath his feet. Their marriage, which he had always believed had grown into genuine love despite its political origins, had apparently been compromised from the very beginning. "Who approached you?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "A woman named Margaret Volkov," Isabella replied, finally meeting his eyes. She presented herself as a representative of a humanitarian organization called the Continental Peace Coalition. "She told me they were working to prevent wars and reduce the suffering of common people by ensuring that no single kingdom became too powerful or aggressive." The name meant nothing to Alexander, but he filed it away in his memory for future investigation. "And you believed her?" Isabella's laugh was bitter and filled with self-recrimination. "I wanted to believe her. She told me I could make a real difference in the world, that I could use my position as queen to prevent conflicts and save lives. She made me feel important, like I was part of something greater than just being a political pawn in my father's games." "So you agreed to spy on Valdoria before you even knew me," Alexander said, the pain evident in his voice despite his efforts to remain composed. "Not spy," Isabella protested, though the word rang hollow in the current circumstances. "At first, they only asked for general information about court life, about the mood of the people, about economic conditions. Nothing that seemed harmful or secret. They told me it was to help them understand how to provide better assistance to struggling regions." Alexander moved to examine the scattered documents on the floor, his trained eye quickly identifying several that contained highly classified military information and diplomatic correspondence. "But it didn't stay general, did it?" Isabella shook her head, tears beginning to flow again. As the years passed, their requests became more specific. They wanted to know about trade negotiations, about military exercises, about the kingdom's financial reserves. Each time, Margaret would explain how the information would be used for peaceful purposes, how it would help prevent misunderstandings that could lead to war. "And the money?" Alexander asked, remembering the conversation he had overheard about Swiss bank accounts and payments. "The money started small," Isabella admitted, her voice growing even quieter. "They said it was to help me establish charitable works that would benefit the people of Valdoria. I used it to fund orphanages and schools, to provide medical care for the poor. I told myself I was using their resources for good." Alexander felt a stab of recognition as he remembered the numerous charitable projects Isabella had initiated over the years, works that had made her beloved among the common people of Valdoria. To learn that these noble endeavors had been funded by the betrayal of state secrets was like discovering that a beautiful garden had been fertilized with poison. But the amounts grew larger, he said, more as a statement than a question. Isabella nodded miserably. Eventually, the payments became so large that I couldn't possibly justify them as charitable donations. Margaret told me I deserved compensation for the risks I was taking, that I should secure my own future in case my activities were ever discovered. She convinced me to open accounts in Switzerland and other countries, supposedly for my own protection. Alexander walked to the window, staring out at the storm-lashed grounds of his castle while processing this devastating revelation. 25 years of marriage, 25 years of believing he knew the woman who shared his bed and raised his children, and it had all been built on a foundation of lies and espionage. Our children, he said suddenly, turning back to face Isabella with a look of horror. Please tell me our sons know nothing about this. Isabella's face showed genuine shock at the suggestion. Of course not. I would never involve Marcus and Adrian in anything like this. They know nothing about my activities, and they never will if I can help it. Some small part of Alexander's heart felt relief at this assurance, though it did little to diminish the enormity of the betrayal he had uncovered. Prince Marcus and Prince Adrian, now 22 and preparing to take on greater responsibilities within the kingdom, would be devastated to learn about their mother's treachery. What about the recent information? Alexander demanded, picking up one of the documents from the floor. This contains details about our new defensive positions along the eastern border. This intelligence could allow our enemies to plan invasion routes that would bypass our strongest fortifications. Isabella's face crumbled as she realized the full implications of what she had shared. Margaret told me it was to help negotiators understand Valdoria's defensive capabilities so they could propose fair and balanced treaties that wouldn't make us feel threatened. Margaret made it clear that if I tried to stop cooperating, they would expose my previous activities. The scandal would have destroyed you, destroyed our children, destroyed the kingdom. Alexander felt a flash of anger at this revelation. So instead of coming to me for help, instead of trusting that we could find a way through the crisis together, you decided to continue betraying state secrets to protect yourself from the consequences of your earlier betrayals? They also threatened our children, Isabella said quietly, her voice barely audible. Margaret showed me photographs of Marcus and Adrian at university, detailed schedules of their daily routines, information about their friends and professors. She made it clear that if I didn't continue cooperating, my sons might suffer unfortunate accidents. This revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. The knowledge that his children had been threatened, that they had unknowingly been living under the shadow of potential violence because of their mother's activities, filled him with a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. How recent were these threats? He asked, his voice deadly calm in a way that Isabella recognized as far more dangerous than shouting. The last contact was 3 weeks ago, Isabella replied, shrinking back at the controlled fury in her husband's expression. Margaret demanded the information about the eastern defenses and reminded me about the insurance policies they had regarding our family's safety. Alexander's mind raced as he processed this timeline. 3 weeks ago, he had noticed that Isabella seemed particularly nervous and distracted, but he had attributed it to stress from planning the upcoming harvest festival. Now he understood that she had been struggling with another round of blackmail and threats against their children. The man who was here tonight, Alexander said, indicating the still unconscious stranger. Who is he? I don't know his real name, Isabella admitted. Margaret always referred to him as the collector. He's the one who actually receives the documents and arranges the payments. He's also the one who shows me the photographs of our children when they want to remind me what happens if I refuse to cooperate. Alexander looked at the unconscious man with new understanding. This was not just a spy or a handler of intelligence assets. This was someone who specialized in intimidation and threats, someone who had been systematically terrorizing his wife to ensure her continued cooperation in the betrayal of their kingdom. Isabella, Alexander said, his voice gentler now as he began to understand the complex web of coercion and fear that had trapped his wife for so many years. Why didn't you tell me? Even if you couldn't confess to the earlier activities, why didn't you tell me when they started threatening our children? Isabella looked up at him with eyes full of anguish and regret. Because I was a coward, she said simply. Because I was terrified that you would see me as I really am. A traitor who sold out her own kingdom for money and idealistic fantasies. Because I thought I could handle it myself. that I could find a way to protect our children without destroying everything we had built together. The storm outside was beginning to subside, but the emotional tempest within the secret library was far from over. Alexander realized that the situation was far more complex than a simple case of treachery motivated by greed or ideology. His wife had been trapped in an increasingly dangerous web of espionage and blackmail for decades, manipulated by professionals who understood exactly how to exploit her fears and weaknesses. But understanding the circumstances that had led to Isabella's betrayal did not diminish the fact that state secrets had been compromised, that the security of Valdoria had been breached, and that the lives of his people had been put at risk. As king, Alexander had responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal feelings, no matter how conflicted they might be. The next morning dawned gray and cold over Valdoria Castle, the storm having passed but leaving behind an atmosphere of foreboding that seemed to permeate the ancient stones. Alexander had spent the sleepless night in his private study, wrestling with the most difficult decision of his reign. Before him lay two paths, both fraught with terrible consequences for everyone he loved. Isabella sat in the castle's most secure chamber, not quite a prisoner, but no longer free to move about as queen. She had spent her own sleepless night providing a full confession to Captain Henrik and the kingdom's chief intelligence officer, revealing every detail she could remember about her decades of espionage activities. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Hundreds of state documents, detailed military intelligence, diplomatic correspondence, and financial information had been systematically transferred to the mysterious Continental Peace Coalition. As dawn broke over the kingdom, Alexander summoned his most trusted advisors to an emergency council session. The group included Captain Henrik, Lord Chancellor William Ashford, General Marcus Thornfield, and Chief Intelligence Officer Dame Catherine Blackwood. Each had been briefed on the basic facts of Isabella's treachery, and each understood the gravity of the crisis facing Valdoria. The immediate security threats have been assessed, Dame Catherine reported grimly. Based on the Queen's confession, we must assume that our enemies have detailed knowledge of our military capabilities, defensive positions, trade agreements, and diplomatic strategies. Several ongoing operations must be immediately suspended or restructured. General Thornfield leaned forward, his weathered face grave with concern. Your Majesty, the information about our eastern border defenses is particularly damaging. If hostile forces have this intelligence, they could potentially plan invasion routes that would bypass our strongest fortifications. I recommend immediate repositioning of our forces and construction of additional defensive works. Lord Chancellor Ashford cleared his throat nervously before speaking. Sire, while the military implications are severe, we must also consider the political ramifications. If word of the Queen's activities becomes public knowledge, it could destabilize the entire kingdom. The people's faith in the monarchy could be irreparably damaged. Alexander had spent the night reaching the same conclusion. The revelation that Queen Isabella had been selling state secrets for over 20 years would not only destroy the royal family's reputation but could trigger civil unrest, provide opportunities for external enemies to attack a weakened kingdom, and potentially lead to the collapse of the ancient monarchy that had ruled Valdoria for centuries. What do we know about this Continental Peace Coalition? Alexander asked Dame Catherine. The intelligence chief consulted her notes before responding. We've found references to similar organizations operating throughout Europe, all apparently connected to a larger network of intelligence gathering and political manipulation. The woman known as Margaret Volkov appears to be a professional handler of high-value assets. We believe she may be connected to foreign governments seeking to destabilize the region. Captain Henrik added his own sobering assessment. The prisoner we captured last night has said nothing during interrogation, but documents found on his person suggest he was prepared to eliminate both you and the Queen if the operation was compromised. This was not merely espionage, Your Majesty. This was preparation for more direct action against the royal family. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on Alexander's shoulders. The conspiracy against his kingdom had been even more extensive and dangerous than he had initially realized. Isabella had not simply been selling information. She had been unknowingly participating in what appeared to be a long-term plan to weaken or destroy Valdoria from within. Bring the Queen to me, Alexander commanded quietly. I need to speak with her privately before we proceed. When Isabella entered the study a few minutes later, Alexander was struck by how much she seemed to have aged overnight. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, hung loose around her shoulders. Her elegant bearing had been replaced by the hunched posture of someone carrying an enormous burden of guilt and fear. Most striking of all, her green eyes, which had always sparkled with intelligence and warmth, now appeared hollow and defeated. "Sit," Alexander said gently, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Despite everything that had happened, despite the magnitude of her betrayal, she was still the mother of his children and the woman he had loved for most of his adult life. Isabella sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolchild awaiting punishment. "I know what you have to do," she said quietly. "I've known since the moment you discovered my activities. I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions." Alexander studied her face, searching for any trace of deception or hidden agenda. Are you? Are you truly prepared for what must happen now?" "I understand that I will likely be executed for treason," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I understand that my name will be remembered as a symbol of betrayal and disgrace. I understand that our children will grow up knowing their mother was a traitor to the crown they serve. Is that really what you think this is about?" Alexander asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Do you think I'm simply trying to decide how to punish you for your crimes?" Isabella looked confused by the question. "Isn't that exactly what this is about? I committed treason against Valdoria. The penalty for treason is death. As king, you have no choice but to uphold the law." Alexander stood and walked to the window overlooking the castle courtyard, where he could see servants and guards going about their morning duties, unaware that the very foundations of their kingdom had been shaken by the events of the previous night. "Isabella, you seem to believe that justice and punishment are the same thing. They are not. Justice requires that we consider not only what has been done, but why it was done, and what response will best serve the kingdom's interests." "I don't understand," Isabella said, though Alexander could hear a hint of hope creeping into her voice. Alexander turned back to face his wife. "The full extent of your betrayal will remain known only to my inner circle. Officially, you suffered a sudden illness last night, and will be retiring from public life to recover in a private villa in the southern provinces. You will be provided with a modest income and basic security, but you will never return to Valdoria Castle, never again participate in state affairs, and never again see our children except under the most extraordinary circumstances." Isabella stared at him in shock. You're not going to execute me?" The Continental Peace Coalition achieved their goals through 25 years of careful manipulation and psychological coercion, Alexander explained. "They targeted a young woman who felt powerless and alone, and they systematically exploited her fears and idealistic impulses to turn her into an unwitting weapon against her own kingdom. While your actions were unquestionably treasonous, the circumstances suggest that you were as much a victim of this conspiracy as Valdoria itself." "But the damage I've caused," Isabella protested, apparently struggling to accept this unexpected mercy. "The damage has been done and cannot be undone," Alexander agreed. "But executing you now would not restore the secrets you shared or strengthen the defenses you compromised. It would only create a public scandal that could further destabilize the kingdom and provide our enemies with additional opportunities to exploit our weaknesses." Isabella buried her face in her hands and began to sob, 25 years of carefully suppressed guilt and fear finally finding release. "I'm so sorry," she whispered through her tears. "I'm so sorry for everything I've done to you, to our children, to our people." Alexander felt his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to maintain the composure required of a king making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Your apologies cannot change what has happened, Isabella. But your cooperation in helping us understand and counter the ongoing threat from this organization can still serve some useful purpose." "I'll tell you everything I know," Isabella promised immediately. "Every detail of my contacts with Margaret and the others, every method they used to communicate, every piece of information I shared. If it will help protect Valdoria from further damage, I'll spend the rest of my life helping you understand how they operate." Alexander nodded, though he felt no satisfaction in this small victory. The intelligence Isabella could provide would indeed be valuable in protecting the kingdom from future threats, but it could never fully compensate for the secrets that had already been lost or the trust that had been shattered. "There is one more thing," Alexander said, his voice heavy with the weight of final judgment. "Our marriage is ended. I cannot continue to share a life and A throne with someone who betrayed the very foundations of everything I've devoted my existence to protecting. You will be remembered publicly as a beloved queen who retired due to illness. Privately, you will live with the knowledge that you destroyed the most important relationship in your life through your own choices." Isabella nodded, accepting this final blow with the resignation of someone who had already lost everything that mattered to her. "I understand. It's more mercy than I deserve." As guards escorted Isabella away to begin her journey to permanent exile, Alexander stood alone in his study, surrounded by the symbols and responsibilities of kingship that now felt heavier than ever before. The crown that had been passed down through generations of his ancestors seemed to weigh more on his head, reminding him that the price of ruling was sometimes the sacrifice of personal happiness for the greater good of the realm. In the weeks that followed, Valdoria quietly restructured its defenses, renegotiated critical agreements, and began the long process of rebuilding the security that had been compromised by decades of espionage. The public mourned the sudden illness and retirement of their beloved queen, never knowing that they were actually mourning the death of their kingdom's innocence and the end of an era when the royal family could trust each other completely. Alexander ruled for many more years, earning a reputation as a wise and careful monarch who never again allowed sentiment to override his duty to protect his people. But those closest to him noticed that the king who had once been known for his warmth and openness had become more guarded, more suspicious of those around him. The betrayal by the person he had trusted most had left scars that never fully healed, reminding him daily that even the deepest love could not guarantee loyalty, and that the price of wearing a crown was eternal vigilance against those who would exploit trust for their own destructive purposes.